The white liberal is the one who has perfected the art of posing as the Negro's friend and benefactor. In this political football game, the white liberal is able to use the Negro as a pawn or a weapon.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Black Radicals. We're already 2 months in, and we're going strong. Episode number 5. Before we get started, here's a brief intro into this week's episode.
In this episode, we speak to Professor David McNally, who teaches at the University of Houston, about his latest book, Slavery and Capitalism, A New Marxist History. The book explores Atlantic slavery in the Americas and Caribbeans from the 16th to the 19th century. McNally's contributions to this significant period of history are informed by notes, letters, and historical documents written by enslaved Africans, plantation owners, traders, the founding fathers of America, and the Black radical tradition. First, we would like to give a little background on the transatlantic slave trade. Between 1500 and 1800, 12 to 15 million people were trafficked from Africa to the Caribbean and the Americas. This forced transportation, known as the Middle Passage, was done under such horrible conditions that an estimate of 2 million Africans died during the transportation. Their labor was mostly used on big plantations, where they had to serve the plantation owners to produce goods like tobacco, sugar, and cotton. This contributed to major economic growth in European countries. After uprisings and wars, Britain and the United States abolished the transatlantic slave trade in 1807. Why and how this occurred will tell us Professor McNally, who will also help us debunk the two most promoted right-wing and nationalist narratives about Atlantic slavery and talk about their resistance of enslaved Africans to capitalist slavery. Finally, we will end the episode by asking how we can use this research to inform our politics today, where we face increasingly authoritarian states.
Before we get started on the book itself, can you give us a little bit of a background? Why did you decide to write about this topic? And how did it come about? And your inspirations?
Okay, well, let me start a bit autobiographically, and then I'll sort of situate it more in the current intellectual and political climate. But I'm very much a product of the last great wave of freedom struggles in the United States. As a teenager, a high school student, I joined the movement against the war in Vietnam. And then coming from Canada, I started my undergraduate studies in the United States. And in my first year as an undergraduate, I helped launch a chapter of the Committee to Free Angela Davis and Other Political Prisoners.
Angela Davis is a Black American activist, communist, and author who inspired civil rights and anti-racism movements in the U.S. in the 1970s. She was falsely accused of murder and criminal conspiracy and spent over a year in jail, which sparked a public movement that led to the founding of the Angela Davis Legal Defense Committee.
So these questions of anti-imperialism around the war in Vietnam, of anti-racism in the struggle to defend Angela Davis against the criminal prosecution that she was facing at the time. These were formative politically and intellectually for me. You know, as a teenager going to school just outside of Seattle, Washington, we would go to the Black Panther Party bookshop to find radical literature and to have conversations and that sort of thing. So as I say, these were formative events in my thinking about the world, about imperialism, racism, and capitalism. And even though I moved into the field of political economy and political theory, I maintained those kinds of activist commitments throughout. And I found myself in the context of the Black Lives Matter insurgencies of the last decade or more, returning to the questions of racial capitalism and the centrality of race as a social relationship organizing everyday life in capitalist society. And you could see that in my scholarly writing. I'm trying to address that question in a number of books, for instance, particularly a book I wrote in response to the 2008-9 global economic crisis called Global Slump. Then I'm trying to address imperialism in Africa in my book, Monsters of the Market. My predecessor book to the one we're talking about today, Blood and Money, is subtitled War, Slavery, Finance, and Empire. So you can see I'm returning, but I'll be honest with you, I didn't feel I was doing justice to the importance and the complexity of the question without returning to slavery itself, to New World or Atlantic slavery, and its foundational role in the rise of global capitalism. And that's really what I'm trying to do in the book, Slavery and Capitalism. Now, in terms of intellectual context, here in the United States, in response to the global economic crisis of 2008-9, there was among historians a turn to the study of capitalism. They recognized that in their immersion in cultural history over the last 30 years or so, they actually didn't have the theoretical tools to talk about a global economic crisis. And so there was a turn to political economy among historians, and in particular to raising the question of capitalism as an object of historical study. But I wasn't very happy with many of the liberal assumptions about capitalism itself that were running through the literature. And similarly, I wasn't happy about the theorizations of slavery because I was troubled by the fact that enslaved people were being theorized as commodities, but not as commodity producers. That is to say, as living laborers with the capacity to resist and fight back. And so slavery and capitalism is in significant measure an intervention there. But in addition, to properly address the role of enslaved people as producers of global commodities and as actors resisting, organizing, mobilizing, and ultimately breaking the back of the slave system and emancipating themselves, I had to return to a tradition which has so little presence among historians in the United States, and that's a Black radical tradition, particularly for my purposes, defined by C.L.R. James, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Sylvia Wynter. And I'm sure we'll get into more of that. But that's just to give you a sketch, both personal and intellectual, political, of where I was coming from.
I think at least some of the writings that I know about from Angela Davis, they really come out in your book. I think in particular, if I remember correctly, when you talk about sex work, when you talk about sort of how some people romanticize the idea of slavery being this society as being a matriarchal society. And I think you also do, from my opinion, an excellent job of like bringing like this, humanizing these stories, bring them to life. Like you say, not just making them as commodity, like slaves as just commodities, but commodity producers and the social relations that are, that come with it, which is for me at least, super, super fascinating.
Yes. And as you say, Angela Davis is extremely important because early on, from the very beginning of the 1970s, in her work, she's raising the question of Black women and the Black family. And, this is something that has now shaped a whole field of feminist and Black feminist writing about both slavery and then later about emancipation. And she's critically reminding us that class is weaving its way in and out of this story, because one of the great accomplishments of her Women, Race, and Class
Mhm.
is to say to us, don't, when you raise the demand for women to work, and she's saying this to predominantly white feminists in the global north,
Mhm.
Black women have always worked.
Yeah.
And that included for wealthy white women. So Angela Davis's work is so important because she brings gender, race, and class into a unified framework of analysis,
Mhm.
not treating them as separate,
Yeah.
but in fact as interwoven. So yes, I appreciate you flagging the importance of her contribution.
In that regard, I want to start with just some things that popped out to me that, you know, were so interesting. And I'm from Sudan, and like some things, like some capitalist processes that I didn't think about sort of came out in the book. And the first thing that came out was you mentioned, for example, maps as being a tool of empire. Can you unravel that for us, please, and historicize that a little bit for us?
Yes, wonderful point, because we take today mapping the world for granted.
Mhm.
But when we take our sights outside of capitalist society and we think about the ways in which human beings lived on the land for millennia, what we realize is that land did not consist of these geometrically measurable, mappable units, meters, yards, kilometers, miles, and so on. Land was lived, and people understood land in terms of its social and communal histories.
Mhm.
This piece of land was the land worked by this household. It had been worked by their predecessors going back this many generations, and so on. So land was understood qualitatively. It was understood in terms of its social and communal histories. But of course, when capitalism comes along, and particularly agrarian capitalism in Europe, and then colonial agrarian capitalism around the world, they are seizing this land. They are driving its inhabitants off this land. They are turning it into a commodity that can be bought and sold into one abstract unit of space in relationship to other abstracted units of space, all of which can be measured and quantified, given a monetary value, and so on. And so the operation begins with mapping, because land will be sold at so many dollars, pounds, marks, etc., per hectare. And all of this process of mapping, measuring, and quantifying land involves this radical break from its lived histories. The land is no longer the site where your grandparents brought forth your parents and worked the land and raised a household. It is not saturated by memory and identity in those ways. It's a pure commodity that has purely quantitative meaning as representing so much space equal to so many dollars, marks, pounds, etc. So that transformation requires mapping as a fundamental technology in commodifying land. And I appreciate you bringing it up, because it's such an important
Mhm.
marker of our movement into capitalist social relations, where the commodity reigns supreme.
I think the reason why it stood up to me, I think, is because it resonates with like theoretically with like the capitalist property relations and the transition debate and stuff like this. But also on a personal level, for example, in Sudan, before colonialism, people used to like measure land through like arbitrary ways. Like one of the ways would be someone would take a stone and then throw it as far as they can. And then they'll be like, okay, wherever that stone lands, for example, that's, that's your border. And then the same thing that way and this way. So there wasn't like this like meters and stuff. And then when the British came, and even after the British, like when they wanted to take land for like mass projects, they'd be like, where's your deed? And obviously you don't have a deed when you have like this relationship to land. So I really appreciated you highlighting this, and it resonated with me, I think, quite a bit.
It's a hugely important point because historically, enclosure, that very capitalist notion of enclosing land, is so foreign to how village communities lived, with open fields that neighbors crossed in between, that maybe their animals grazed on one another's patches a little bit, that they sometimes farmed together and helped one another dig the earth and so on. So this idea that land, rather than being a space where people meet and collaborate, move through the world together, becomes these enclosed units. So yes, I strongly agree with that.
And I think right now we're living in a moment where it'd be remiss of us not to mention what's going on today in Palestine as well, and how that is also one of the most extreme forms of this process.
It is because, what the Palestinian people are saying when someone like Trump comes along and says, well, we'll move you all out and we'll give you land somewhere else. And the Palestinian people are reminding us that land is a site of memory and identity in all the ways that we were talking about. They're not just geometrical blocks. This is lived experience. This is identity. The land has shaped us and made us who we are, just as we have made the land. And so Palestinians are pushing back against this purely commodified notion of land, and more power to them.
Absolutely, 100%. Another aspect of the book, I think one of the things that when people even look at movies or like literature or books about slavery, they're sort of taken aback by the sheer violence of it. And I think I had to ask you about this because this I couldn't find in other readings or histories of this, which you mentioned how planters actually employed soldiers as overseers. And this sort of, I mean, it's not the sole reason why there's violence, obviously, but this sort of contributed to the violence. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, this is really important because I'm arguing that the New World plantation with enslaved labor was this incredible capitalist innovation. And it required a degree and intensity of violence that was almost unprecedented, which is to say, you are now taking enslaved people who have been captured, bought, and sold, branded, renamed, and you're putting them in these large, large work gangs.
Mm-hmm.
And you are trying to get them to work the soil in a factory-like industrial fashion, all moving through the fields at the same pace, keeping up the same speed, notwithstanding their differences in size, age, physical strength and stamina, and so on. And this required a degree of violent discipline, which was unlike anything else we were seeing anywhere in the world during the rise of capitalism. And of course, it just so happened that England, that was pioneering this system, was constantly at war during this era with Spain, with the Netherlands, and especially with France. So it always had tens of thousands of men who had both inflicted violence, but also been rigorously subjected to violence. Soldiers and sailors were subjected to whippings. So they had both had violence normalized for them, and of course, they had internalized this incredible set of aggressive male violent practices in everyday life. And so when it came to finding people who could be employed to drive and that was the word they used. These were, drivers and overseers to drive workers in the field, to inflict violence upon their bodies when they either failed to work fast enough or to meet their quotas, or they showed insolence or rebellion. They now had practitioners of violence who were available to them. And so we need always to understand the degree of militarization of labor and life, which was at the heart of the plantation system. And so it's a very, very important historical point.
Just to bring it back to today, I think it's not the same thing, but like it's like saying, you know what, in order for me to discipline workers here, it's not the same thing, but I'm going to employ like IDF soldiers or something like, which is a crazy violent, like it's purposefully violent. And I thought that piece of history was really, 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 I mean, it sort of puts the pieces a little bit together. On that, I wanted to ask, for example, not a lot, but some of the discourse from the right sometimes sort of tries to like dismiss slavery by saying that, well, at a certain point, there was white slaves, and even there were like more white slaves than black slaves. And in the book, you talk about the significant differences between these two. Can you, first of all, can you what's it called, propagandize this myth for us and tell us what actually happened?
Yes, because what's happening here, Mohammed, is that people are picking up either disingenuously in some cases, like on the right, or perhaps naively in other cases, on a historical fact, which is that colonial capitalism relied, particularly in the Atlantic world, on a variety of forms of bonded labor. And by bonded labor, I simply mean people who did not have the freedom to choose their employment. They were legally bound to an employer who had the right to inflict violence on their bodies for non-performance of duties. And so it's true. There are tens of thousands of European indentured laborers in the early going, particularly from Ireland, England's first colony. And they do live in brutal conditions. However, and it's a very important however, there was always a foundational difference between indentured service, which was usually for 3 to 7 years, depending upon the form of bondage, the indentured servant relation, and full-fledged chattel slavery. Full-fledged chattel slavery is meant to be a permanent enslavement. That was not the norm. That was incredibly exceptional for people from Europe. But in addition, in the early going, because full-fledged modern racism was not as developed as it would become, there were certain kinds of ambiguities about the status, particularly of Irish indentured servants and enslaved Africans, so that we find in Barbados a series of joint uprisings, Irish servants and enslaved Africans rebelling together. Very early on, the planter class, the slave-owning class in the Caribbean and the United States, decides that they will racially demarcate these groups.
Racial demarcation is a synonym for racial segregation, which describes the social, legal, or physical division of people into hierarchical categories based on perceived race.
They will racially demarcate these groups as a mechanism of social control. So, in other words, what they do is they start to ease the terms of white servitude so that they are less like those of enslaved Africans, and they will intensify the domination of enslaved Africans. And they don't do this because they're humanitarian towards one group. They do this for pure and simple reasons of social control. The joint uprisings are dangerous. Ultimately, their fundamental supply of enslaved labor is coming through the kidnapping of millions of Africans. So it's cost efficient and socially efficient to demarcate these groups, which means that over time, slavery becomes an inherited condition for Africans, and servitude becomes an increasingly temporary and less onerous condition for indentured European servants, to the point that it effectively dies out over time. And so, to suggest that the conditions are the same is to deny a whole series of historical realities. And moreover, it is to ignore that the enslavement of Africans was intensified over time. Early going, there were more cases of so-called manumission, of freeing enslaved Africans and allowing them to enter the free population. Increasingly and interestingly, particularly in the British colonies and the United States, the freeing of enslaved people becomes rare and often illegal in these colonies. They are out to essentially brand slavery as entirely racial. Slavery becomes an attribute of Black people, of people of African descent, and freedom becomes attached to whiteness. And that's the racial order that capitalism essentially grows under, which is why I think we need to understand the system as one of racial capitalism.
I personally think that a lot of people making the point that there's no differences. I think it's a little bit disingenuous because it's clearly we can see the effects of it today. You know what I mean? It's something that hasn't really gone away, and just to dismiss not just the history but the goings on in our society today, I think is, for my taste, a little bit disingenuous, to be honest.
Yes, and it's as you say, it's incredibly ahistorical because if, as I think every serious-minded person is going to agree, if we are living with the afterlives of slavery, and I can tell you, living in the U.S. South, I feel it. It's all around us, the afterlives of slavery. Then that tells us that the conditions to which Black people were subjected were not the same as those to which white people were subjected. That's the reason why we have books like How the Irish Became White. Maybe their racial status was ambiguous in the 17th century, but they achieved legal whiteness and the rights that came with it, and people of African descent did not. This is a fundamental bifurcation of social circumstances, and we live with them today with all of those after effects.
I wanted to quote something in the book back to you, and maybe we can a little bit talk about it, which is racial capitalism. And so in the book, in page 85, you write, and I quote, Atlantic racial capitalism involved the production of commodities by laborers who were legally construed as commodities themselves. This was a unique and uniquely capitalist innovation in law and social domination. Can you hone in on this and tell us what the difference is and why this is so important for your work and for us to understand?
Yes, absolutely. Central to any serious definition of capitalism is that it is a system in which commodity production of goods for exchange with money on markets, becomes the dominant way in which human beings reproduce themselves and their lives. We buy our food, we buy our housing and our clothing. But of course, most human societies, people produced the bulk of their own subsistence goods. They produced their own food, their own shelter, their own clothing. They didn't need to go to markets to purchase commodities for this purpose. So goods were produced for their immediate usefulness to human life, not as a means of accruing money through markets. And so if that's at the heart of global capitalism, then we have this apparent paradox that people who were being bought and sold, enslaved people, were also producing commodities to be bought and sold. And I really want, in other words, readers to get this paradoxical, apparently, relationship. Because what it means, and it's critical for our understanding of New World slavery, is that these people being bought and sold were fundamentally dissimilar to all other commodities. A bag of cotton does not resist. A bag of cotton or a barrel of sugar do not fight back, kill their owners, as enslaved people often did, or their overseers. And so I'm trying to get people to understand that this was an attempt to commodify human beings as producers of commodities, but that in fact it could never fully succeed. It could never fully succeed because human beings cannot be turned into inert objects. It cannot be done. And this is the fatal flaw of slave capitalism. And it's why ultimately the enslaved people could bring down the entire system of Atlantic slavery. And so getting at the heart of that relationship, on the one hand, it's a capitalist relationship because these commodified people were producing global commodities, cotton, rice, sugar, tobacco, indigo, and coffee for world markets. They were producers of immense capitalist fortunes. But this also meant that the system had a profound vulnerability because those producers had the capacity to fight back and to withdraw their labor. And as you know, I argue that as we move into the 19th century, mass strikes by enslaved people became critical to the destruction of the slave system in places like Barbados, Jamaica, the US South, and so on. So really focusing on this paradox, commodified people producing global commodities, allows us to see both the capitalist dynamics, but also the immense possibility for resistance and even self-emancipation by people who have ostensibly been commodified.
I think this is such an important point for multiple reasons. For us today, I think it's important because it shows us that, I mean, I was born in 92, and basically everyone in my generation and after has experienced nothing but just an increasing crisis after crisis after crisis with a pandemic in the middle. And I think it's important because it shows us how even people in significantly worse circumstances than us could not be broken. And their forms of resistance was creative, it was inspirational, it was really, really, really powerful. And I think you bring this in the book, and I think this is one of the most fascinating things I found about your book, about telling these stories. And I want you to tell us some, like maybe some of these stories, but one of the phenomena that I think perhaps encapsulates this sort of most vividly is sex work, right? If you say that, for example, slaves are just commodities, then sex work, as we know it, shouldn't really exist because they are just commodities, and they can't be bought and sold, or like their bodies and stuff like this, or provide the service. So can you give us examples, and can you also like concentrate on the sex work aspect of it? Because I find that quite fascinating.
Yes. We see within New World slavery this enormous agency of enslaved women. And it's very important to emphasize because, for all kinds of understandable reasons, the blatant oppression to which they were subjected just stands out so sharply. In addition to being either field laborers or domestic servants, in other words, like all enslaved people, treated as beasts of burden, as producers of commodities and wealth for the owning class. In addition to that, they were sexually abused and assaulted, and they had interference with their reproduction, often being treated as breeders of future generations of enslaved people. So the magnitude of that oppression stands out.
Yeah.
But they were also operating in a system in which they used everything they could to leverage their own positions. And so simply demanding payment for sex with an overseer or a master, for instance, represented a small shift in the relationship. And it represented a small shift because they were saying, you are transacting with me as another human subject. Okay? This is not to deny the exploitation and oppression within the relationship any more than with sex work today. But it is to say that even within what often look to us to be the most brutal and oppressive circumstances, there is an agency on the side of these people. And sex workers would try to use their own agency to extract concessions, monetary payment, keeping their children out of the fields, getting moved themselves from the field to domestic labor in the big house. And we know even of cases, particularly in Jamaica, of enslaved women who actually accumulated small amounts and bought their freedom from their owners because over years of sex work, they were saving. And so it's a reminder of the incredible resourcefulness of people who are staggering under the weight of oppression, yet still finding ways to carve out little areas of autonomous action within these lives. And therefore, there are ways in which they are keeping alive hopes and dreams of freedom for the next generation. You know, as you know from the book, one of the things I really want to emphasize is the cultures of freedom that enslaved people built and which were so important to the transmission of resistance across the generations. And so, you know, I just saw a story yesterday about a group of sex workers in the United States who formed a union. Well, okay, they had no legal right to organize unions, enslaved women in the period in which we're talking about, the 18th and 19th centuries. But nevertheless, they showed that capacity to leverage their intelligence, their cunning, their spirits of resistance in ways that meant that, however oppressive, they were cultivating freedom dreams that we should never forget. They're an indispensable heritage, I think, for all of us today who imagine that our freedom struggles are far from over.
But I think it's such an important point. The last thing that you mentioned, which is they might not be quote unquote unionized, but some of the resistance stories that you talk about, it's not a formal union, but it's actually people who worked in community, in union. Like, for example, and I thought this was so creative, where if you had like a slave who would run away, the overseer would actually engage with the community of slaves or the group of slaves who were in contact with like the runaways to like negotiate. And this is basically a union with a different name or a different circumstance.
100%. And I love that you've seized on that example because I think people often don't appreciate that most runaways were not trying to escape the plantation system as a whole for a reason that we've actually already touched on. This is where their loved ones were. Their kin were on the plantation. Their lovers were either there or on the plantation next to it. So most escapes were protest movements or strikes, the withdrawal of one's own labor. And enslaved people, as we know, had what's correctly been described as a rival geography. They knew the forests, they knew the rivers and streams, they knew the mountains. And if they escaped, and the enslaved people in their communities knew where to leave food for them. In
Yeah.
their after hours, they would take food and leave it next to a tree in a basket in the woods somewhere. And the employing class, the owning class, they knew this. They knew the community was keeping these people alive while they were fugitive. And so you're right. If they wanted them to come back, they would have to come and send a message. And very often they're negotiating. So they say to one of the elders in the Black community, let Billy know that if he comes back, I won't punish him too harshly. And then the community says to them, Master, Billy will only come back if you promise that there will be no lashes. Okay, this is, as the Jamaican historian Mary Turner put it, this is collective bargaining, right?
Yeah.
These are two sides negotiating the terms of a return to work. And so you're right, we should never underestimate the degree of collective organization and activity that was running through these communities. Otherwise, we can't understand the enormous uprisings when they come. They were coming out of a soil of resistance
Yeah.
that was already in place. Were they at a much higher and more dramatic level? Absolutely. Outright mass rebellion was incredibly risky. And so you only went down that road when you had a degree of confidence. But it wasn't possible unless people were used to already exercising their capacities for resistance in a collective way.
And I think here this segues perfectly to like maybe a nerdy, but also like a theoretical question and something that you talk about in the book, which is I think there is a tendency even amongst are to say, for example, that the proletarization process is necessary in order for you to overthrow capitalism because of consciousness. So the story goes. And I think you quote C.L.R. James by saying that the slaves were basically proletarian.
C.L.R. James was a West Indian-born writer, activist, and historian who is most known for his book, The Black Jacobins, written in 1938, a Marxist study of the Haitian slave revolution of the 1790s.
But also to just pick up on what you said, I think sometimes people attribute it from our tradition, at least, or from my tradition, attribute it to like some sort of like, you know, if people are able to unionize, if there's because like there's a certain form of industry, a certain thing, then they're going to revolt. But in fact, I think as we just discussed in this example, and Pastor C.L.R. James teaches us, you know, it wasn't as it's the levels that were imagined. It wasn't like the consciousness or the industry might be not a wise term, but like as industrious as it is presumed. Can you unravel that and perhaps tell us why you chose C.L.R. James's words and how you build up on his conclusions?
Yes, and the C.L.R. James passage to which you're referring, it happens if you're not careful because it looks like almost a passing comment in his much larger story. But of course, that story is the narrative of the Haitian Revolution. It's the story of a 13-year war of formerly enslaved, self-emancipated people of African descent who defeat successively the three greatest empires in the world at the time. They defeat the Spanish, the British, and the French empires
Yeah.
and build an army to do that, an army of tens of thousands at its peak, commanded by Toussaint Louverture. Now, what C.L.R. James is saying to us is think about the level of organization that this required. that could only have come out of a highly socialized form of life. And then he says to us, well, you know something? The sugar plantations of Saint-Domingue, as it was then as a French colony, later to become Haiti, that those sugar plantations were among the largest workplaces in the world. 300, 400 enslaved workers toiling in the fields and workshops together. In other words, going back to the point we were just on a moment ago, these are not fragmented, atomized individuals. They're already working in enormous and living in cooperative networks. And they have a kind of set of a collective practice of resistance and organization. So all of the things that Marxists have historically attributed to the distinctiveness of the modern working class, collective forms of labor and life, all that is there. All that is there. Moreover, even if they could not legally form unions for collective bargaining, as we were just talking about, they were doing it, and they had other kinds of social networks and institutions. We know that enslaved people regularly went to the forests for music and celebration. They partied and danced, and they set up traps so that if patrols came along, the horses would stumble and trip. They would have enough notice to sneak back in the dark of night and escape from the patrols. In many cases, they worshiped in the forests. Later, and in some locations, they were able to form their own independent black churches. We also know that Islam was more extensive in parts of the enslaved New World than many historians originally recognized. So they had practices of worship being done in groups. They had recreational and musical practices being done in groups. They worked in the fields in groups, and they sang in unison as they did this. So C.L.R. James is saying to us, don't be surprised then that they have the capacity to meet in the forests and plan an uprising, as they did in August of 1791. And an uprising which began by setting the plantations aflame, literally burning the fields, and then culminated in the creation of an army sufficient to see down and defeat three empires. So this is a marvelous insight. And even though it's not the heart of his story, he's being clear to us that by any stretch of the imagination, this resembles the classic kind of collective movement of proletarians that Marxists talk about. And it makes sense, therefore, that we begin to see this as part of global working class history and not as some separate story. And let me just add on that point quickly, Mohammed, that living here in the United States, one of the things that really stands out is that for at least 150 years, every major working class insurgency in the United States has been sparked by an earlier wave of anti-racist black revolt. It is the self-emancipatory struggles of the Civil War in the United States that give rise to a great burst of strikes and unionization across the 1870s, for instance. And often you have socialist radical union organizers who had been white abolitionists during the Civil War. In other words, it's their abolitionism, their commitment to the black freedom struggle, which makes them such powerful and effective working class organizers more generally. You see the same thing as well when the civil rights movement breaks the back of McCarthyism in the United States.
McCarthyism was an anti-communist movement and describes the political repression in the U.S. during the 1940s and 50s, initiated and named after Senator Joseph McCarthy.
When the civil rights movement breaks the back of McCarthyism in the United States and opens up new space for union activism and strike activity throughout the 1960s and 70s. And of course, we should never forget that Dr. Martin Luther King is assassinated when he's in Memphis supporting the overwhelmingly Black sanitation workers strike. So anti-racist struggle has often been the spark, the inspiration for labor and wider working class struggle, multiracial working class struggle here in the United States. And so this mechanistic separation of the two, as if they reside in two different social universes, so misunderstands our actual history and our present.
Yeah, I wish you can tell that to all the fellow leftists who don't see it that way. But I absolutely 100% not just agree, but I think we're living it today around the world, but also here in Germany as well. I think the most radical aspects of our movements are people who are committed anti-racist, and it's sort of a symbiotic relationship with class naturally. Yeah, to go on a little bit forward, I know you mentioned, for example, about the Haitian Revolution. One of the things that I wanted to ask you to elaborate to us is, I know this is a little bit jumping forward, but just to contextualize it, why did the British, quote unquote, abolish slavery? There's obviously the famous quote, which is, you know, I'm paraphrasing, but like Britain created slavery just to abolish it. So can you tell us why did they do that, and what are the myths behind it? Did they do it because of their sort of kindness and their, altruism, or was it something different?
Yes, and I am trying in the book to disabuse readers of two narratives, neither of which holds up in my view. The first is the one you've already implied, that it's the advance of humanitarianism, that essentially the British public and British politicians become so enlightened that they realize this is morally indefensible and they abolish it. The second is the claim that the slave system of plantation production had become inefficient and unprofitable. I see no evidence of that. All the evidence that I marshal in the book indicates that plantation production remained enormously profitable for the planter class, for the slave owning class throughout the Caribbean, the US South, and so on. In the British case, we'll stay with them, I don't think it's any accident that you get the great uprising of enslaved people at Christmas 1831. At least 30,000 enslaved people lay down their tools and enter into a mass strike. And they're very clear that they see this as the highest form of resistance, the use of the mass strike. 30,000 is a very modest estimate for the numbers who left the fields. And in all the British inquiries afterwards, this idea of downing tools, of leaving work, and so on, can be found out of the mouths of enslaved people. Within a year of this strike, Britain has moved and passed its legislation in Parliament to end slavery in the British colonies. Well, as I say, it's not because it was unprofitable. It's because the costs of social control have become too high. They are now faced with the risk of an essentially permanent revolutionary struggle by enslaved people who have felt their capacities. They recognize what they did.
Mm.
And they realize that the planter class is now having to receive officials from Britain who are doing inquiries, asking what happened, and even interviewing some of them. In other words, British colonial policy is reckoning that we've already seen, they know, they've already seen a mass strike in Barbados in 1816. They've seen a mass strike in the newly colonized Demerara, which had been seized from the Dutch in 1823. Now they've seen one, 1831-32, in Jamaica. This has become a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And every time they have to make the calculation, do you send thousands and thousands of troops to put these revolts down at a time when you're locked in all kinds of European conflicts, for example, and you're trying to finance other colonial ventures in Asia and so on. And they simply reach the recognition that enslaved people have become effectively ungovernable.
Mm. Mm.
And so this is a turning point. And the same thing as W.B. Du Bois will point out for us in his great book, Black Reconstruction in America, something very similar will happen during the Civil War in the United States, when 500,000 enslaved people leave the fields, get themselves behind Union lines, where they're initially not welcome. The North, Lincoln does not intend emancipation. He just wants to stop the revolt of the Confederacy and their separation from the Union. But enslaved people force the issue in their hundreds of thousands, and ultimately they force their way into the Union Army. 200,000 of these self-emancipated enslaved men join the Union Army or Navy. So they're withdrawing their labor power from the South, and now they're remobilizing it militarily to defeat the Confederacy, to defeat the planter class. And so in both cases, you have episodes of self-emancipation. In the British case, they recognize, okay, the social cost of continuing to put down these revolts, which get larger and more coordinated each time, the social costs simply aren't justified. So it's true. There was great work done by abolitionists inside Britain. A lot of so-called white working class people had become anti-slavery. That is very true. There was a mass boycott, for example, of sugar for tea and coffee in Britain at the time. And this was often coming from workers of Manchester and so on, who also supported the North during the Civil War. It was one of the great battles that Marx fought to get the British labor movement to support the North against the South. But fundamentally, it's a self-activity of enslaved people that breaks the back of the system in Britain, in the United States, and elsewhere. And I think this is, as you were saying earlier, in times like this of hard neoliberal authoritarianism on the rise globally, of the kind of violent suppression that the people of Sudan and Palestine have been facing, to be able to draw on the history and the legacies of these struggles and to remind ourselves that against incredible odds, people have brought down systems of authoritarian and oppressive rule. This is a very, valuable lesson that should resonate for us today.
Absolutely. I mean, on that last point, at least for me personally, I think anti-colonialism has to, as a matter of principle, as a matter of fact, has to end with abolition. It can't just end with like national sovereignty and independence. It has to end with abolition. But also, I think one thing that you mentioned in the book, and this is something that stands out and sort of like, gives weight to what you're saying, which is even after slavery was quote unquote abolished, the London banks were sort of profiting from the from the southern plantations, which is sort of puts like a lot of shade, or like a lot of doubt, and the claim that basically, oh, they did it out of the goodness of their heart. If they did it at the goodness of their heart, why is all the money, or not all the money, but why is so much money coming to like the city of London, basically?
Exactly. The British banking system was the financial backbone of the global trade in cotton produced by enslaved people in the United States. The marketing, financing, and so on of cotton by enslaved people was completely integrated into global circuits of capital that were overseen by British banking houses. So you're right. This was not anything resembling some ethical conversion that had
Mm,
happened among the British ruling classes. If they could profit in less direct ways from the slave system in the Americas, they would, and they did. They continued
mhm,
to do it, much in the same way that the French banking system continued to exploit Haiti
mhm.
after independence. They will milk every bit of wealth that they can out of these circumstances and these arrangements.
And on Haiti, I think it's just quite recently where Haiti had to pay off its debt to these colonial overlords.
I mean, can you imagine being told that it's your responsibility now to repay your former owners for the fact that you freed yourselves because you had been property and
Unbelievable.
you now needed to compensate for that, and that for hundreds of years this has been accepted
Yeah.
as a reasonable business arrangement. I mean, the shame that should
Unbelievable.
fall on every French government official and banker who participated in this is astronomical.
It's really like you said, is like we are used to like a certain form of violence on the capital, but this kind of violence where you sort of hold the great 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 grandchildren of enslaved people, the debt of abolition, or the debt of freedom. Yeah, it's just something, just I don't know what kind of system creates this unbelievable abuse of power. Unbelievable.
Exactly. And hence the reason we continue to talk about the afterlives of slavery.
Yeah. I think the more egregious thing, at least for me personally, and this is like my sort of bone to pick, is the people who keep on saying that, race is just a divisive tool against unionizing workers, where as if we don't include race in this, it doesn't make sense. One of the last things I wanted to ask you is your final comments on the book. And can you tell us, I know we touched upon it a little bit here and there, but can you tell us what is the significance and the importance of learning about this history?
Well, I think I would really try to underline the following. First, the centrality of slavery and plantation slavery to the history of global capitalism, and recognizing that bonded labor in a whole variety of forms has been foundational to the system, not some marginal thing happening here and there around the edges. And so, for all anti capitalists, we need to understand that so called free wage labor exists along a spectrum of different kinds of unfreedom within
Mm,
modern capitalist society, of which chattel slavery was the most extreme form.
mm,
And we then need to see everybody producing for capital as part of the working class, not simply those sections who happen to occupy the position of so called free wage labor. The international working class, or the global proletariat, was multiracial from the start, and it was differentiated by race. And therefore, in understanding that this is a struggle against racial capitalism, that racial differentiations were used as mechanisms of social control of different sections of the working class, the same way migration is used today to deprive migrant workers of so many rights and freedoms in the global north. These differentiations are always in play, and it means that any authentic working class politics has to be anti-racist at its core. Anti-racism is not a little moral gesture for after when you've done your working class activism. It has to be foundational to it, at the absolute groundwork of what working class activism and politics means today. And then related to that as the second point is to begin to recognize the richness of the struggles of what I've called the chattel proletariat as an integral part of global working class history. You know, Mohammed, it's very hard to point to any other section of the international working class in the first half of the 19th century that used the mass strike more often and more effectively than did enslaved workers. We have episode after episode of the use of the mass strike as a means of social resistance and social rebellion. There's an enormous amount to learn from this history, but it means that people need to get their blinkers off and to recognize this is the international working class we're watching here. And there is a reason that the freedom dreams, the music, the cultural forms that this enslaved proletariat created continue to inspire us today. If you want to look at the musical idioms in which freedom dreams were expressed here in the United States, where I'm working, it's gospel, it's soul, it's blues, it's jazz, it's hip hop. It is all of the musical derivations coming out of the African experience in the New World. And there's a reason they carry those freedom dreams, because those freedom dreams have not yet been realized. And they continue to be a source of inspiration. So one of my key arguments is let's recover these stories as part of international working class history, because we will all be richer for it.
I wanted to ask you one last question that's a little bit off the book and something that I personally have been grappling with. Today we have, I think, one of the most severe conditions for workers is, for example, what some people refer to as modern slavery in Gulf countries, let's say. Can we draw any lessons from the history of African slaves in the New World that we can apply to these kinds of circumstances in the global South, in particular in these regions where just it seems very, very bleak, basically, for organizing?
Yes, I think we can. And let me also highlight the importance of the larger question that you're raising, which is, if we're thinking about the history of capitalism, isn't it interesting that in the neoliberal period of the last 40 years, as markets have been freed, so has slavery advanced, the new slavery. And it's a contemporary reminder that there is no contradiction between capitalist free markets and the advance of slavery. In fact, neoliberalism, the freeing up of markets, as you know, has gone hand in hand with the growth of new forms of slavery. So, yes, that's incredibly important. On the Gulf states, you're right. Unfree labor, bonded labor plays this absolutely fundamental role. I think that the work of the Palestinian political economist Adam Haniya is really valuable in this regard, because he's showing us the ways in which the Gulf monarchies are doing this in complete complicity with the United States, for instance. And you're right. We always have to be careful about stretching historical analogies. But if what many of us on the left have historically said is right, that the struggle for Palestinian liberation is going to be a regional struggle, that it is as much a struggle against the monarchies which are complicit with Israeli apartheid. And we must see it as a regional struggle, predominantly of Arab working classes across the region. Then this, I think, will be true as well for the role of migrant workers in the Gulf states. They are likely to be able to advance in concert with region-wide struggles which are shaking up the monarchies and military dictatorships of the region. You mentioned earlier that idea of focusing on abolition, not national sovereignty. And in many ways, this analysis returns us to that point, to the thinking about a regional struggle against authoritarianism, monarchy, and Israeli apartheid as coordinated and interlocking struggles. And of course, that's one of the great things we learned from the Atlantic world as well. I'll just give you one example of this, but we discover in the southern United States after the Haitian Revolution, all kinds of enslaved people naming their male children Toussaint, after Toussaint Louverture. They were taking inspiration from Haiti. Their imaginations were not nationally bound. This was the common wind, as Julia Scott puts it, of the Atlantic freedom struggle. And I think we need to think that way as well about many of the workers who find themselves in the new slavery today.
If any Sudanese comrades are listening in the Gulf countries, the situations have been much worse and we have overcome them, and maybe we should learn from these situations. And with that, is there any final words that you'd like to give?
Mohammed, I think we've touched on so much, and it has been a real pleasure speaking with you. I want to encourage you, your comrades whom you're organizing this podcast with and working with politically, and all of your listeners. Keep up this important work. Know that you're not alone, that you have friends and comrades working on other fronts, and we will do our best in the coming years to increase our bonds of solidarity.
Today's episode was produced by Mohammed Anoa. You can follow our Instagram at black_radicals or write us an email at blackradicalsgermany@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.